Billionaire caught his new wife beating his disabled son, but the maid risked everything to save him. Hi, my beautiful family. Let's begin with a prayer wrapped in love, for me and for you. Dear God, please cover me with your healing hands. Guide every step of my treatment, calm my spirit and restore my strength. And Lord, bless my entire YouTube family, every heart that supports me. Protect them, provide for them, and let love overflow in their lives. Amen. This is your Mr. Peter. I'm still in New York receiving treatment, but my heart is right here with you. I know not hearing my voice today may feel disappointing, and I understand. But please, my beautiful family, don't leave the story because of this message. Some of our new members leave too soon. You can skip the intro if needed, but please stay for the story. If something touches you, feel free to share in the comments. I read every word with love. While I heal, James is here to hold this space for me with care and respect. Please keep me in your prayers as I pray for you too. Now let's begin today's story with love, hope, and the bond that holds us all together.
If you're reading this, it means I chose to save our baby instead of myself, and I wouldn't change a thing. The billionaire's hands trembled as he read his wife's final letter for the 100th time, her elegant handwriting blurred by tears that refused to stop falling. 8 years had passed since Rhonda left this world, yet her words still felt like a dagger twisting in his chest. My dearest Jonathan, by the time you read this, our little miracle will be in your arms, and I'll be watching over both of you from somewhere beautiful. The doctors gave me a choice that no mother should ever have to make, but for me there was no choice at all. Our baby's life matters more than mine. Please don't be angry with me for this decision. Be proud. We created something extraordinary together. Jonathan Nava closed his eyes, remembering that devastating moment in the hospital corridor when Dr. Martinez had approached him, the physician's face etched with impossible sorrow. Mr. Nava, there are complications. The umbilical cord is wrapped around the baby's neck, and your wife's blood pressure is critically high. We can try to save one of them, but the doctor's voice had broken. We can't save both. The decision must be made now. But Rhonda had already chosen their path. When they wheeled her into that operating room for the last time, she had grasped her husband's hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Promise me you'll love our baby enough for both of us. Promise me." Those became her final words. Now, standing in the nursery they had decorated together, walls painted the softest yellow because they wanted to be surprised, tiny clothes hanging in the closet that Rhonda had selected with such joy, the father felt the weight of that promise crushing his chest. Their son, David, sat at his adaptive desk working on homework, his 8-year-old face scrunched in concentration. The boy's legs were supported by custom braces, and his hands sometimes trembled when he gripped his pencils. But all his father could see was Rhonda's delicate nose and his own dark hair and the most brilliant mind he'd ever encountered. "I've never loved anyone the way I loved you," Rhonda's letter continued. "Remember our quiet Sunday mornings when you would make coffee and I would steal the newspaper crossword? Remember how you used to kiss my forehead when you thought I was sleeping, but I was always awake, just savoring that moment of pure love? Those were the happiest times of my life. Not the galas or the business dinners or the fancy vacations, just you and me and the promise of forever." The empire he'd built stretched across 3 states, hotels, real estate, investments worth more than most small countries. But he would trade every dollar to have one more Sunday morning with her. Just one more stolen kiss, one more sleepy smile, one more chance to tell her that she was his entire world. "Papa, can you help me with this math problem?" David's voice pulled him from his grief. The boy struggled sometimes with fine motor control, making writing challenging, but his mathematical reasoning amazed his teachers. "Of course, buddy," Jonathan replied, moving to his son's side with the careful attention he'd learned through years of adaptation. He'd mastered everything from physical therapy routines to adaptive technology, determined to give his child every advantage. "I got the answer, but my handwriting is wobbly today," the boy explained matter-of-factly. There was no self-pity in his voice. David had learned to accept his challenges with remarkable grace. As Jonathan helped steady his son's hand, he marveled at the transformation in himself. The ruthless businessman who had once stayed at the office until midnight now structured his entire day around David's needs. Board meetings revolved around therapy schedules. Conference calls were conducted while preparing adaptive snacks. His mother, Eleanor, had initially worried about his decision to raise the child alone. "Darling, that boy is going to need more care than you realize," she had said during one of her early visits, her voice gentle but concerned. "Perhaps we should consider specialized facilities. There are wonderful places." "No." His voice had been steel. "He's my son. Our son. He stays with me." Eleanor had studied her son's face, the same stubborn determination that had made him a billionaire by 35, and nodded slowly. "Then we'll make sure you have everything you need. But Jonathan—" She had paused, choosing her words carefully. "That boy is going to need a mother's love too someday. Rhonda would want that for him." Now, as he watched his son work through complex equations with patience and determination, Jonathan wondered if his mother was right. Could he really provide everything David needed? Could any one person replace the love of two parents? "Don't blame yourself if things get difficult," Rhonda's letter seemed to whisper to his doubts. "Don't think you're failing me if you need help. I want you to find happiness again. I want you to find someone who will love our baby the way I would have. When that time comes, and you'll know when it comes, don't feel guilty. Love isn't finite. There's room in your heart for David and for someone new. Just make sure she's worthy of you both." The child finished his homework and promptly curled up against his father's chest, a nightly ritual they both treasured. Jonathan sat in the rocking chair Rhonda had insisted they buy, moving back and forth in the gentle rhythm she had practiced for hours, dreaming of lullabies she would never sing. Outside, New York City buzzed with its endless energy, but inside this room time moved differently. Here, he wasn't a billionaire or a business mogul or the man whose name appeared on magazine covers. He was simply a father who had learned to braid hair by watching YouTube tutorials, who had memorized every physical therapy exercise that might help his son gain strength, who read bedtime stories to a boy who hung on every word. "Papa," David's sleepy voice interrupted his thoughts. "Do you think Mama can see me from heaven?" The question pierced Jonathan's chest. "I think she sees everything about you, buddy. How smart you are, how brave you are, how kind you are to everyone you meet. Do you think she's proud of me, even though I can't run fast or write perfectly?" Jonathan's throat tightened. "She's proud of everything you are. You're exactly the son she dreamed of." "I will always be yours, even if I'm no longer here. Take care of our miracle baby. Love him enough for both of us. And when you're ready, when you find someone who sees David the way we do, as perfect and precious and worthy of everything, love her too. You have my blessing, my heart, my everything." The letter was signed with lipstick kisses and tear stains, and Jonathan carefully folded it back into the envelope, marked "For my love" in Rhonda's distinctive handwriting. Tomorrow he would face another day of board meetings and decisions and the weight of running an empire. But tonight, he would keep his promise. He would love his son enough for two parents, and somehow, some way, he would figure out how to be everything the boy needed. Even if it meant his own wounded spirit would never fully heal. Even if it meant learning to love again seemed impossible. even if it meant trusting someone else with the most precious thing Rhonda had left behind. He kissed his son's forehead and whispered the same promise he made every night. "I've got you, little man. Papa's got you. Always." In the quiet of that room with city lights painting gentle shadows on the walls, a billionaire learned that the greatest wealth wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in the trust of a sleeping child and the promise to a love that would never die. But deep in his heart, he knew Eleanor was right. David needed more than one parent could provide. The question was, could he find someone worthy of his son's precious trust? Chapter 2. The Weight of a Mother's Last Wish. 2 months after David's 8th birthday party, the first one where he'd asked why he was the only child without a mother, Jonathan realized his son's innocent question was actually a plea for something more. "Papa, why don't I have a mommy like Tommy at school?" 8-year-old David asked this question while his father helped him with his evening physical therapy exercises, his small legs working diligently to build the strength that came naturally to other children. Jonathan's hands stilled on his son's leg braces for just a moment. This conversation had been inevitable, but it still hit him like a physical blow every time the boy brought it up, which was happening more frequently as he grew older and more aware of what other families looked like. "You did have a mommy, sweetheart," the father said gently, lifting David onto the parallel bars they'd installed in their home gym. "Mama loved you so much that she made sure you could come into this world safely. She's watching over you from heaven." David's dark eyes, so much like Rhonda's, studied his father's face with the wisdom that often surprised adults. "But Tommy's mommy makes him pancakes shaped like dinosaurs and braids hair and gives the best hugs. I want hugs like that too." The innocence in his son's voice nearly broke Jonathan's composure. Over the past 8 years, he had learned to braid hair. David insisted on growing it long like a rock star, mastered pancake flipping in creative shapes, and gave what he hoped were pretty spectacular hugs. But the boy was right. There was something missing, a gentleness, an intuitive understanding that Jonathan, for all his love and devotion, couldn't quite replicate. "You know what, buddy?" Jonathan said, steadying his son as he took careful steps between the bars. "Maybe someday we can find someone special who could be like a mommy to you. Would you like that?" David's face lit up with pure joy. "Really? She could live with us and everything?" "Maybe," Jonathan replied carefully, not wanting to make promises he couldn't keep. "But she would have to be very special. Someone who loves you exactly as you are." That evening, after David was asleep, Jonathan found himself in his study, staring at the framed photo of Rhonda on his desk. She was laughing in the picture, her head thrown back with complete abandon, caught in a moment of pure happiness during their honeymoon in Italy. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered to her image. "How do I find someone who will love him the way you would have?" The house felt enormous and quiet around him. Despite having a full staff during the day, he insisted on handling David's evening routine himself. Dinner together, homework help, bath time, bedtime stories. These sacred rituals had become the foundation of their life together. Jonathan had thrown himself into fatherhood with the same intensity he brought to business. He attended every doctor's appointment, every physical therapy session, every school event. He had learned about adaptive equipment and inclusive education and the latest treatments for cerebral palsy. His son's room was filled with adaptive toys, books about children who were different and special, and pictures of athletes and artists who had thrived despite physical challenges. But lately, he noticed things he couldn't fix with money or determination. The way David watched other families at school pick up, studying the mothers with their easy affection and intuitive understanding. The questions about why he was different and whether anyone would ever love him the way parents loved normal children. Dr. Sarah Chen, David's pediatrician, had gently suggested that the boy would benefit from additional emotional support as he matured. Children with disabilities often struggle with self-esteem and belonging, she had explained during their last visit. Having multiple positive adult figures in his life could be tremendously beneficial, particularly a nurturing female presence. The doorbell chimed, interrupting his thoughts. His mother's weekly visit, Eleanor Nava, still insisted on checking in on her son and grandson every Thursday evening, bearing gifts and unsolicited advice in equal measure. "Jonathan, darling," Eleanor said, entering the foyer with her usual elegant composure. At 74, she remained a formidable presence, silver hair perfectly styled, posture impeccable despite her gradual physical decline. "How's my favorite grandson?" "He's your only grandson, Mother," Jonathan replied with familiar affection. "And he's asleep. You're later than usual." Eleanor's expression grew serious as they settled in the living room. "I had a lengthy appointment with Dr. Williams today." Something in her tone made Jonathan look up sharply. "Everything all right?" "Well, that's what I wanted to discuss." Eleanor accepted the tea her son poured for her hands trembling slightly, a detail that sent alarm bells ringing in his mind. "The tests show that my heart condition is progressing. Not immediately dangerous, but we need to be realistic about the future." "What does that mean exactly?" Jonathan's voice was carefully controlled, but inside panic was rising. His mother had been his rock through Rhonda's death and David's early years. The idea of losing her, too. "It means I have perhaps 2 to 3 years before things become difficult," Eleanor said with characteristic directness. "Which brings me to something I need to say, and I need you to listen without interrupting." She set down her teacup and looked at her son with the same intensity he remembered from childhood, the look that meant serious conversation was coming, whether he wanted it or not. "You've been a remarkable father, Jonathan. Rhonda would be so proud of the man you've become, the way you've loved that boy. But David needs more than what either of us can give him." "Mother, we've discussed this. Let me finish." Eleanor's voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "I'm not talking about sending him away or hiring more staff. I'm talking about finding him a mother. A real mother who will love him as her own, who will be there for him when we're gone." Jonathan stood and walked to the window, his hands clenched. "You think I haven't thought about that? You think I don't know he needs more? But how do I find someone who won't see his disability first? Someone who won't consider him a burden or a charity case?" "By looking in the right places," Eleanor said gently. "Not among the society women who see marriage to you as a business transaction. Look for someone with substance. Someone who works with children, perhaps. Someone who already understands that love isn't about perfection." "And what if I can't love her?" The question came out raw and honest. "What if my heart died with Rhonda?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. "Love isn't always the grand passion you had with Rhonda, darling. Sometimes it's the quiet partnership, the shared commitment to something bigger than yourself. David deserves a mother who will fight for him, protect him, cherish him. You deserve a partner who can share the load. I don't want to marry someone just for David's sake. That's not fair to anyone involved. Then find someone you can respect, someone you can genuinely care for. Love can grow from respect and shared purpose." Eleanor stood, her movement careful but determined. "I'm not asking you to replace Rhonda. I'm asking you to give David what every child deserves: a complete family." That night, after Eleanor left, Jonathan checked on his son one more time. The boy was sprawled across his bed, covers kicked off, one arm wrapped around the stuffed triceratops Rhonda had bought before David was born. In sleep, he looked so peaceful, so perfect, that it was easy to forget about the challenges he faced every day. "What do you think, buddy?" Jonathan whispered, adjusting the covers. "Should we try to find you a mommy?" As if sensing his father's presence, David smiled in his sleep and mumbled something that sounded like, "Love you, Papa." The father's chest clenched with overwhelming protective love. He would move mountains for this child, would face any challenge, make any sacrifice. If David needed a mother, then Jonathan would find him the most loving, devoted, worthy woman in the world, even if it meant opening his wounded spirit to the possibility of pain again, even if it meant trusting someone else with the most precious thing in his universe, even if it meant admitting that love could take different forms, that maybe, just maybe, he could learn to love again in a new way. Standing in his son's doorway, billionaire Jonathan Nava made a decision that would change all their lives forever. Tomorrow he would begin the search for David's mother. He just prayed he would recognize her when he found her. Chapter 3. The Perfect Deception. Rita Castellanos had perfected the art of becoming exactly what broken men needed. She'd had 3 years of practice watching Jonathan Nava's wounds, and she knew precisely which scars to touch to make him believe she could heal them. "Mr. Nava, your 2 o'clock appointment has arrived," Rita announced from the doorway of Jonathan's corner office, her voice carrying that practiced blend of competence and warmth that had taken her months to perfect. She lingered in the doorframe longer than necessary, letting the afternoon light catch the auburn highlights she'd carefully had added to match the shade of hair in the photo of his dead wife that sat on his desk. The navy dress was calculated too, conservative enough for the office, but cut to suggest the curves hidden beneath professional fabric. 3 years of studying this man, 3 years of learning his rhythms, his needs, his unguarded moments of grief. 3 years of becoming indispensable while hiding the truth that sometimes, late at night in her empty apartment, she stared at the photo of another child, a boy with dark hair and twisted limbs who would never grow up to need a mother's love. "Thank you, Rita." Jonathan looked up from his contracts, and for the first time since she'd started working for him, she caught something different in his gaze. Not just professional appreciation, but actual awareness of her as a woman. Finally. "Could you please reschedule the 4 o'clock? David has a doctor's appointment, and I promised I'd be there." The familiar stab of pain hit her chest at the mention of his son's medical needs. David, 8 years old, cerebral palsy, the same age Miguel would have been if the accident hadn't. "Of course," Rita replied smoothly, pushing down the memory before it could surface completely. "I've already taken the liberty of moving Mr. Henderson to tomorrow morning and arranged for tickets to his daughter's recital as an apology. I know David's health always comes first." Jonathan's eyes widened slightly with surprise and something that looked like gratitude. Rita had spent months researching Henderson's family, banking personal details for exactly this moment. "That's incredibly thoughtful, Rita. David's appointments can be complicated to reschedule." "Any child with special needs deserves accommodating care," Rita said, and for a moment the practiced warmth in her voice was genuine. She did understand. She understood too well what it meant to sit in medical waiting rooms, to fight insurance companies, to watch a small body struggle against limitations it didn't choose. The difference was that her child hadn't survived long enough to need accommodations. "Rita," Jonathan said as she prepared to leave, his voice carrying an unfamiliar hesitation, "would you mind staying after the meeting today? I'd like to discuss something with you." Rita's pulse quickened, not with romantic excitement, but with the cold satisfaction of a plan finally coming to fruition. "Certainly, Mr. Nava." The afternoon meeting dragged endlessly. Japanese investors discussing hotel acquisitions, profit margins, and market penetration strategies that should have commanded Jonathan's attention. But Rita noticed his distraction, the way his eyes occasionally drifted to her as she took notes with practiced efficiency. She had positioned herself perfectly in the conference room, close enough to assist, angled so the late sunlight caught the gold highlights that echoed his dead wife's coloring. Every gesture was calculated, every smile timed for maximum impact. When the investors finally departed with signed contracts, Rita knocked softly before entering with fresh coffee, prepared exactly the way he preferred. Black, no sugar, served in the ceramic mug his son had made in occupational therapy. She had spent weeks learning David's schedule, his therapy routines, his adaptive equipment needs. Not out of genuine care for the child, but because the quickest path to Jonathan's heart ran directly through his disabled son. "You wanted to speak with me?" Rita asked, settling into the chair across from his desk with perfect posture, her hands folded carefully in her lap. Jonathan seemed to struggle with his words, running a hand through his dark hair, a gesture Rita had catalogued as a sign of emotional vulnerability. "Rita, I hope this isn't inappropriate, but are you seeing anyone? Seriously, I mean." Rita allowed carefully practiced surprise to flicker across her features before looking down at her hands in apparent embarrassment. She had rehearsed this moment in her mirror for months. "No, Mr. Nava. Well, this position has been so fulfilling. Most men don't understand the demands of working with someone as important as you." The hesitation was perfectly timed, suggesting modesty rather than calculation. "I'm asking because David has been asking about having a mother." Jonathan's voice grew stronger as he found his emotional footing. "My mother thinks he would benefit from having a stable female influence in his life." "Here it comes." Rita arranged her expression into soft understanding, fighting down the bitter irony that she was being recruited to mother another woman's disabled child when her own lay cold in a cemetery plot she could no longer afford to visit. "David is such a remarkable boy," Rita said, and this time the warmth in her voice was genuine, twisted by grief into something sharp and painful, but real. "So intelligent and brave despite his challenges." She had studied the language of special needs advocacy, had learned the phrases that would mark her as understanding rather than pitying. She knew these words because she had once lived them. "The thing is," Jonathan continued, "I'm not looking for traditional romance. I'm not ready for passion or grand gestures, but I am looking for a partnership. Someone who could be a mother to David and a companion to me." Rita let silence stretch between them, using it to her advantage. Inside her chest, something cold and hungry stirred. Not love, but a desperate need for the security and belonging that had been ripped away from her when Miguel died, and his father blamed her for the accident that destroyed their family. "Are you asking me to consider becoming David's mother?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am," Jonathan said simply. "You understand David's needs, you know the demands of my life, and you've never shown anything but patience with his limitations." Limitations. The word hit Rita like a physical blow, dragging her back to sterile hospital rooms and physical therapy sessions and the constant grinding weight of caring for a child whose body betrayed him daily. She had been patient with Miguel, too. Patient until the day her exhaustion and momentary inattention cost him his life. "Mr. Nava, Jonathan," she corrected herself with calculated shyness, "I'm honored that you would consider me. Any woman would be privileged to mother such a special child." The words tasted like ashes in her mouth, but she forced them out with apparent sincerity. "I want to be completely honest about expectations," Rita continued, her voice strengthening with what appeared to be courage. "You're talking about marriage without love." "I'm talking about commitment, respect, partnership," Jonathan replied. "Love might grow over time, but I won't promise what I can't guarantee. My heart, Rhonda, was everything to me, but I can offer you security, honesty, and genuine care." Rita nodded as if considering this carefully, when in truth she had already accepted the moment he'd asked. Security was what she needed. Legal claim to this family was what she craved. The child, the child was a complication she would handle once she had what she needed. "And my role with David?" she asked, leaning forward to project intense interest. You would be his mother in every way that matters. Medical decisions, educational choices, his future. We would share all of it. He's the most important thing in my world, Rita. Anyone who marries me needs to understand that completely. Something twisted in Rita's chest, half grief, half rage. She understood perfectly. She had once felt that fierce, protective love for a disabled child. She had once centered her entire world around therapy schedules and adaptive equipment, and the desperate hope that love could overcome physical limitations. It hadn't been enough to save Miguel. It wouldn't be enough to save David either, if he became an obstacle to the security she needed. I've always wanted to be a mother, Rita said softly, the lie mixing with truth in ways that made her voice ring with apparent authenticity. Watching friends start families while I focused on my career has been difficult. David is such a wonderful child. His disability doesn't define him. She had memorized these phrases from grief counseling sessions she'd attended after Miguel's death, back when she still believed healing was possible. So you'll consider it? Jonathan asked. Rita's smile was luminous with what appeared to be overwhelming gratitude. I would be honored to be David's mother and your wife, Jonathan. As they discussed practicalities, engagement timeline, wedding plans, living arrangements, Rita felt the familiar cold satisfaction of a successful manipulation, but underneath it lurked something more dangerous. The memory of another child, another promise to love and protect, another family destroyed by her failures. This time would be different. This time she would prioritize her own survival over a disabled child's needs. This time she wouldn't let misplaced maternal instincts destroy her chance at security. When Jonathan suggested involving David in the wedding planning, Rita's agreement was perfectly enthusiastic. I want him to feel like this is his celebration too. That evening, as Jonathan introduced her to his son, Rita looked into David's trusting dark eyes, so much like Miguel's had been, and felt something crack inside her chest. Are you really going to be my mommy? David asked with 8-year-old directness. If you'd like me to be, Rita replied, her voice warm with what Jonathan heard as love, but was actually grief reshaping itself into something harder and more dangerous. David threw his arms around her neck, and for a moment Rita felt the ghost of another child's embrace. But this time she wouldn't let love make her weak. This time she would protect herself first, even if it meant failing another disabled child who needed protection, even if it meant becoming the monster she'd once feared. The performance had been perfect. Jonathan saw a woman ready to love his son. He had no idea he was looking at a mother whose own love had turned to poison. Chapter 4. Behind Closed Doors. Martha Wallace had learned to read the spaces between words, the silences that spoke louder than speech, skills honed by 26 years of watching people decide whether she was worth keeping, and she recognized the exact moment Rita Castellanos made that same calculation about David. We should hire some household help, Jonathan suggested over breakfast on their fourth Tuesday as a married family, watching David navigate his adaptive utensils while Rita sat across from them, her attention divided between her phone and maintaining the illusion of maternal interest. Martha stood in the doorway with the morning mail, observing dynamics that felt achingly familiar. She had spent her childhood learning to recognize the subtle signs of adults growing tired of accommodation, the barely perceptible sighs, the delayed responses, the way loving patients could curdle into resentful obligation when they thought no one was watching. What a thoughtful idea, darling, Rita replied with practiced brightness. I do want to spend every possible moment bonding with David. The words were perfect, but Martha noticed what Jonathan missed. Rita's eyes never left her phone screen, her smile never reached her eyes, and her body language suggested someone performing a role rather than living it. Martha knew that performance intimately. She had watched it in the faces of 3 different foster families before she aged out of the system. Rita, after breakfast, can you help me finish my volcano project? David asked hopefully, orange juice dribbling down his chin in a way that made Rita's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Of course, sweetheart, Rita replied automatically, though Martha caught the micro-expression of distaste that flickered across her features before the maternal mask slipped back into place. During the interviews that followed, Martha sat quietly in her wheelchair in the corner of the living room, studying each candidate with the analytical skills that came from a lifetime of reading people's true intentions toward those they perceived as different. 6 candidates came and went. The woman with 20 years of experience spoke about David in clinical terms that made Martha's skin crawl. She recognized the language of professionals who saw conditions rather than children. The one with stellar references possessed a nervous energy that suggested someone uncomfortable with the realities of adaptive care. Another seemed genuinely kind, but clearly had no understanding of the psychological complexity that came with growing up different in a world designed for others. Then came Martha's turn for the interview. She had debated whether to use her wheelchair or her forearm crutches, finally settling on the chair because she wanted to gauge their reaction to visible difference immediately. No point in wasting anyone's time if they couldn't handle the reality of who she was. "Tell me about David," she said during her interview, settling into the space with the natural confidence that came from years of claiming her right to exist in rooms that weren't designed for her. What makes him laugh? What are his dreams? What keeps him awake at night? Jonathan's face lit up as he talked about his son, David's obsession with paleontology, his determination to master challenges that would intimidate most adults, his dreams of discovering new species that would change how people understood prehistoric life. But also his fears about being different, his questions about whether his disability made him less worthy of love, his deep need to prove his value to the world. "He sounds extraordinary," Martha said softly, meaning every word. She recognized David's struggles because she had lived them, had felt the weight of constantly having to prove her worth to adults who saw limitations before they saw possibilities. "That's exactly how we feel," Rita interjected smoothly. "David is such a blessing." Martha studied Rita's face, noting the disconnect between words and expression. There was something brittle about the woman's composure, something that reminded Martha of her second foster mother, the one who had spoken beautifully about inclusion and acceptance right up until Martha's adaptive equipment became too inconvenient to accommodate. "Would it be possible to meet David?" Martha asked. Something shifted in Rita's demeanor at the request, a tension that Martha recognized as the moment when caregivers realized that disabled children had their own voices, their own preferences, their own ability to form attachments that couldn't be controlled. David bounded into the living room with characteristic enthusiasm, his leg braces creating a rhythmic percussion against the hardwood floor. He stopped short when he saw Martha in her wheelchair, his expression cycling through curiosity, recognition, and something that looked like relief. "Hi there," Martha said gently, not overwhelming him with forced cheer or the patronizing tone many adults used with disabled children. "I'm Martha. I hear you're quite the scientist." David's wariness melted into excitement. "Are you in a wheelchair because your legs don't work right either?" "David," Jonathan started to correct, but Martha held up a hand. "It's okay. Yes, my legs work differently than most people's. I was born with something called spina bifida, which means my spine didn't form completely, so I use wheels instead of walking." "Does it hurt?" David asked with the directness that adults often found uncomfortable but Martha appreciated. "Sometimes, but mostly it just means I have to think creatively about how to do things. Kind of like how you use your adaptive tools. We find ways that work for our bodies." David's face broke into a smile of pure understanding. "Martha gets it, Papa. She has a different body, too." For the next 20 minutes, Martha watched David come alive in ways that suggested he rarely had the opportunity to interact with another person who understood difference as a neutral fact rather than a tragedy to overcome. He showed her his adaptive equipment with pride instead of shame, explained his physical therapy exercises like scientific experiments, and asked thoughtful questions about her own accommodations with the curiosity of someone finally meeting another member of his tribe. Rita observed this interaction with what appeared to be pleased interest, but Martha caught the subtle signs of agitation, the way her fingers drummed against her leg, the slight tightening around her eyes when David's laughter grew louder, the almost imperceptible lean away from the conversation as if it made her uncomfortable. Martha recognized those signals because she had learned to watch for them in the adults who held power over her life. They meant someone was calculating cost versus benefit, measuring the inconvenience of accommodation against the social capital of appearing compassionate. "You know what I think?" Martha said after David finished explaining his latest dinosaur theory. "I think you're going to discover something amazing someday. Scientists need people who understand that there are many different ways to exist in the world." David practically glowed with validation. "Really? Even though I'm different? Especially because you're different. The best discoveries come from people who see things others miss." Jonathan's expression suggested he understood he was witnessing something significant. His son connecting with someone who saw his disability as one aspect of his identity, rather than the defining characteristic that required constant management or inspiration. "Martha," he said after David skipped back to his room, "when could you start?" "Whenever you need me, Mr. Nava." "Tomorrow," Rita interjected with practiced smoothness. "I have errands to run, and it would be wonderful to have someone here with David." That night, as Martha settled into the small apartment over the garage that came with the position, she reflected on the familiar patterns she had observed during her first day in the Nava household. Jonathan's love for his son was genuine and fierce, but it carried the protective anxiety of someone who had never experienced disability himself, and therefore couldn't distinguish between accommodating David's needs and sheltering him from the world's potential cruelty. David's hunger for connection with someone who understood his experience was palpable, the kind of recognition-seeking that Martha remembered from her own childhood, when finding another disabled person felt like discovering family. And Rita was performing a role she neither understood nor wanted, trapped by circumstances Martha couldn't yet identify, but recognized from her own experience with adults who had taken on caregiving responsibilities they resented. Martha had spent her life learning to navigate the complex emotions that disability evoked in others. The guilt, the fear, the resentment disguised as sacrifice, the way some people's kindness curdled into cruelty when they realized that accommodation was ongoing rather than temporary. She had survived by becoming indispensable, by proving her worth through perfect behavior and useful skills, by never asking for more than the minimum necessary to survive. But with David, she felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, the fierce protectiveness that came from recognizing someone whose vulnerability mirrored her own. She would watch Rita carefully. She would document every interaction, every moment when the woman's mask slipped to reveal the calculation underneath. Because Martha had learned something crucial during her years in foster care. Adults who resented the inconvenience of disability rarely limited their cruelty to passive neglect. And David, with his trusting nature and desperate need for maternal approval, was exactly the kind of target that brought out the worst in people who saw difference as burden rather than simply another way of being human. Martha Wallace had spent 26 years learning to protect herself from people who couldn't see her worth. Now she would use those skills to protect someone else. Chapter 5. The Sweetest Shield. The first time Martha witnessed Rita's carefully controlled mask crack completely, it happened over something as innocent as David asking why his new mommy's eyes looked so sad. And in that moment, Martha saw the ghost of another child's death, haunting the woman who was supposed to protect this one. 3 weeks into her employment, Martha had learned to navigate the invisible currents of the Nava household with the same careful attention she'd once used to survive foster placements. Jonathan's genuine love for David was steady and predictable. Rita's performance of maternal devotion was precisely calibrated for his presence and conspicuously absent when he wasn't watching. But there were moments, fleeting instances, when Rita looked at David with something more complex than mere irritation, when Martha caught glimpses of raw, unprocessed grief that made her stomach clench with recognition. "Martha, can you help me reach my art supplies?" David asked one Tuesday afternoon, standing before the tall cabinet in his playroom where someone had moved his materials higher than his adaptive reaching tools could manage. Martha retrieved the supplies without comment, though she made a mental note of yet another small accommodation that had been undone. Since Rita had taken over household management, David's carefully arranged environment had been gradually modified in ways that made his independence more difficult. "What are you planning to create today?" Martha asked, settling his supplies on the accessible table. "A picture for Rita," David said with the earnest determination that broke Martha's heart daily. "She's been looking so sad lately. I want to make something that will help her remember happy things." The boy's perceptiveness never ceased to amaze her. At 8 years old, David possessed an emotional intelligence that allowed him to read the adults around him with startling accuracy, a survival skill Martha recognized from her own childhood. "That's very thoughtful of you, sweetheart. What kind of picture?" "A family with a little boy who has braces like me, but everyone is smiling because they love him exactly the way he is," David explained, his small hands already reaching for the adaptive crayons that allowed him to create despite his fine motor challenges. Martha felt something twist in her chest. David was trying to heal Rita's mysterious sadness by creating the very image of acceptance and unconditional love that every disabled child craved, but few actually experienced. As David worked with intense concentration, Martha found herself studying Rita through the kitchen doorway. The woman stood at the marble counter, ostensibly preparing lunch, but actually staring out the window with an expression of such profound loss that Martha felt her protective instincts shift into overdrive. She recognized that look. She had seen it in her second foster mother's face, the one who had taken in a disabled child as an act of penance for some unnamed guilt, only to discover that caring for someone with complex needs required resources she didn't possess. "Martha," David said quietly, not looking up from his drawing, "why do you think Rita seems so scared of me sometimes?" The question hit Martha like a physical blow. "What makes you think she's scared, David?" "Well, yesterday when I fell down during my therapy exercises, she looked at me like she was seeing a ghost or something. And when I tried to hug her, she got all stiff and weird." Martha knelt beside his chair, studying his serious expression. Sometimes grown-ups have complicated feelings that have nothing to do with the children around them. Rita might be dealing with something difficult from her past. Like how you sometimes get quiet when you see other kids with their regular moms. The boy's insight took her breath away. David had noticed her own moments of triggered grief, the pangs she felt watching intact families, the reminder of everything she had lost when her parents decided her disability was too inconvenient to accommodate. "Exactly like that," Martha said softly. "Sometimes seeing certain things can remind people of sad memories, even when they don't want to remember." David nodded with 8-year-old wisdom. "Do you think Rita had someone she loved who was like me? Someone who got hurt?" Before Martha could answer, Rita appeared in the doorway. Her face was composed, but Martha caught the telltale signs of someone who had been crying. Slightly swollen eyes, carefully reapplied makeup that didn't quite hide the blotchiness beneath. "What are you two working on?" Rita asked, her voice carrying that particular brightness that adults used when trying to hide emotional distress from children. "I'm making you a picture," David announced proudly, holding up his drawing. "It's a family where everyone is happy, even though the little boy has legs that don't work the same as other people's." Rita went absolutely still. The color drained from her face so rapidly that Martha thought she might faint. For a moment, the careful mask of maternal interest completely disappeared, replaced by something raw and devastated. That's "That's very sweet, David," Rita managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I drew it because you looked sad, and I thought maybe if you saw that families can be happy even with kids like me, it might help." David continued with the innocent generosity that made Martha want to wrap him in protective armor. Rita's hands began to shake. She gripped the doorframe so tightly that her knuckles went white, and Martha saw her throat work as she struggled to maintain composure. "Rita," Martha said gently, "are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine," Rita replied automatically, but her breathing had become shallow and rapid. I need some air." She fled the room with barely controlled desperation, leaving David staring after her with confusion and growing distress. "Did I say something wrong?" he asked Martha, his small voice thick with the kind of self-blame that disabled children learn too early. "No, sweetheart. You said something beautiful and kind. Sometimes kindness can make people feel emotional if they're dealing with difficult things." Martha spent the next hour helping David finish his picture, while part of her attention tracked Rita's movements through the house. She heard the woman's voice from the garden, sharp with distress as she made what sounded like a phone call. "Can't do this anymore, Mother. Every time I look at him, I see Miguel's face. I see what I failed to protect." The words were too distant for Martha to catch everything, but the tone was unmistakable. Grief, guilt, and something that sounded dangerously like resentment. When Rita returned, her composure had been carefully reconstructed, but Martha noticed new cracks in the foundation. The woman's smile was too bright, her voice too cheerful, her movements too precise, all signs of someone performing normalcy while fighting internal chaos. "David, sweetheart," Rita said, her tone determinedly upbeat. "I think it's time for your rest period. Growing boys need quiet time." It was only 2 o'clock, an hour earlier than David's usual nap time. Martha recognized the strategy, removed the trigger to regain emotional control. "But I want to finish my picture for you," David protested mildly. "You can finish it later," Rita replied, and Martha caught the slight edge beneath the sweetness. "Right now, you need rest." As Martha helped David prepare for his nap, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had seen this pattern before, adults whose personal trauma made them unable to provide consistent care for disabled children, who swung between overcompensation and resentment as their unhealed wounds were repeatedly triggered. "Martha," David whispered as she tucked him into bed, "I don't think Rita really wants to be my mommy. I think maybe she had a little boy like me before, and something bad happened to him." The accuracy of his intuition was both remarkable and heartbreaking. "What makes you think that?" "The way she looks at my braces sometimes, like they hurt her to see. And she knows things about taking care of kids like me that most people don't know unless they lived it." Martha felt a chill of recognition. Rita's knowledge of adaptive equipment, her familiarity with medical terminology, her automatic understanding of David's needs. It all suggested lived experience rather than learned compassion. "David," Martha said carefully, "no matter what Rita is dealing with, you are not responsible for fixing it. You are a wonderful boy who deserves love and protection exactly as you are. But what if she decides she doesn't want me? What if Papa has to choose between keeping me or keeping her?" The fear in his voice broke Martha's heart. This was the terror that haunted every disabled child who had learned too early that love could be conditional. that their needs could become too much for adults to handle. "Your papa will never choose anyone over you," Martha said fiercely. "Never, and I will make sure of that." That night, after David was asleep and Jonathan had returned from work, Martha lingered in the kitchen longer than necessary, listening to the dynamics between husband and wife. "How was David today?" Jonathan asked, his voice carrying the warm attention that never failed to make Martha's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Wonderful, as always," Rita replied with practiced ease. "He made me a beautiful drawing. Such a thoughtful boy." The lie came so smoothly that Martha wondered how many other moments of David's emotional generosity had been rewritten in Rita's reports to Jonathan. "He's been asking about family activities," Rita continued. "Perhaps we should plan something special for the weekend. Maybe a museum visit." Martha recognized the deflection, shifting focus from Rita's emotional state to logistics and planning. It was a survival strategy she had learned from adults who couldn't handle the emotional complexity of caring for someone whose needs triggered their own unhealed trauma. As she prepared for bed in her small apartment, Martha reflected on the dangerous pattern she was beginning to recognize. Rita wasn't just someone who was learning to love a disabled child. She was someone whose previous experience with disability had ended in tragedy and guilt. That made her infinitely more dangerous than simple inexperience or even conscious cruelty. Rita was a woman haunted by the ghost of another child, projecting her unresolved grief onto David while struggling to fulfill a role that triggered her deepest trauma. Martha had survived her own childhood by learning to recognize when adults were drowning in their own pain and therefore incapable of providing safe harbor for someone else's vulnerability. Now she would use those skills to protect David from becoming collateral damage in Rita's unfinished grief. Because Martha understood something that Jonathan couldn't. The most dangerous caregivers weren't the ones who didn't love children. They were the ones whose love had been shattered by loss, leaving behind sharp edges that could cut anyone who reminded them of what they'd failed to protect. Chapter 6. Love in the Shadows. Jonathan Nava had built an empire by believing that every problem had a price point for its solution, until the morning he found Martha teaching David that some of life's most important lessons couldn't be bought, and realized he was falling in love with someone who saw value in ways his money never could. The phone call from his Jakarta construction site had come at dawn, disrupting what should have been a peaceful Saturday morning with David. 47 workers trapped in a collapsed section of his luxury hotel project, 7 confirmed dead. The local foreman's voice carried across continents with devastating clarity. "Mr. Nava, the safety inspections you approved, they weren't sufficient for the soil conditions here." Jonathan had hung up and immediately begun calculating settlement costs, legal fees, media management, stock impact. 20 years of building an empire had taught him to think in damage control before grief, profit margins before human cost. But as he sat in his study, surrounded by financial reports that reduced human lives to liability figures, he heard something through his window that stopped his calculations cold. Martha's voice, gentle and patient, drifting from the garden where she was helping David with his weekend physical therapy routine. "Feel how your muscles work together when you push against the resistance," she was saying. "Your body is finding its own perfect way to be strong." Jonathan moved to the window, watching Martha guide his son through exercises that built both physical strength and emotional confidence. She wore simple jeans and a cotton shirt, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail, but there was something luminous about her complete attention to David's needs. "Martha," David said thoughtfully, pausing in his routine, "do you think some people are worth more than other people?" The question hit Jonathan like a physical blow. His son was asking the very question that Jonathan's business practices forced him to answer daily. Whose lives mattered enough to invest in their safety, whose needs justified expense versus profit. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" Martha replied, settling cross-legged on the grass beside David's adaptive exercise mat. "Well, Papa's hotels are really fancy and expensive, so the people who stay in them must be important. But what about the people who clean them or build them? Are they important too?" Jonathan felt heat rise in his face. Had David overheard his business calls? Had the boy somehow intuited the moral complexity of his father's empire? "That's a very wise question," Martha said seriously. "What do you think?" "I think everyone should be important," David said with 8-year-old certainty. "Because I know what it feels like when people think you're not worth as much because you're different. And it hurts." Martha was quiet for a long moment, and Jonathan saw her blink back tears. "You're absolutely right. Every person has the same value, no matter what they look like, or how much money they have, or whether their bodies work the same way as other people's. Even people like me. Especially people like you," Martha said fiercely. "You see things that others miss. You ask important questions. You have a kind heart and a brilliant mind. The world needs people exactly like you." Jonathan watched his son's face light up with the kind of validation that money couldn't buy, the affirmation that his worth came from who he was, not what he could do or how well he fit society's expectations. "Martha," David said, reaching for her hand, "I'm glad Papa found you. You make me feel like I matter." "You do matter," Martha replied, her voice thick with emotion. "More than you'll ever know." Something cracked open in Jonathan's chest as he witnessed this exchange. Martha wasn't just caring for David's physical needs, she was nurturing his soul, teaching him that value came from character rather than ability, from kindness rather than achievement. When was the last time Jonathan had measured his own worth by those standards? When had he stopped seeing people as individuals and started seeing them as assets, liabilities, resources to be managed? His phone buzzed with another update from Jakarta. The death toll had risen to 12. The families were demanding answers. His legal team was already crafting statements that would minimize corporate responsibility while appearing appropriately sympathetic. But sitting in his study, watching Martha help his disabled son understand his inherent worth, Jonathan felt the carefully constructed walls of his business philosophy beginning to crumble. An hour later, Martha knocked on his study door, carrying a tray with coffee and the sandwich David had insisted she bring to his father. "He was worried that you seemed upset this morning," she explained, setting the tray on his desk. "He wanted to make sure you knew someone was thinking about you." Jonathan looked at the slightly lopsided sandwich, David's careful handiwork accommodating his fine motor challenges, and felt emotion tighten his throat. He made this himself. He insisted, said that sometimes when people are worried about big problems, small kindnesses help remind them what really matters. The simple wisdom of his 8-year-old son, delivered through Martha's gentle understanding, hit Jonathan harder than any board meeting or financial report ever could. "Martha," he said suddenly, "may I ask you something personal?" She settled into the chair across from his desk, her expression open but cautious. "Of course. You seem to understand David's emotional needs in ways that go beyond training or experience. How do you know exactly what he needs to hear?" Martha was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the arm of her chair. "Because I was him once, a disabled child trying to figure out whether I was worth keeping, whether my needs were too much for the adults around me to handle." The simple honesty of her answer stunned him. Jonathan had known about Martha's spina bifida, had seen her adaptive equipment and mobility aids, but he hadn't fully grasped the emotional journey that came with growing up different in a world designed for others. "What happened to your family?" he asked gently. "They couldn't handle having a disabled child," Martha said simply. "My medical needs, my adaptive equipment, the social stigma, it was all too much. They gave me up when I was 6. Jonathan felt rage build in his chest, not at Martha, but at adults who could abandon a child for something beyond her control. "I'm sorry. That should never have happened to you." "It taught me things," Martha replied with quiet strength. "It taught me to recognize when people see difference as burden versus when they see it as just another way of being human. It taught me to value myself based on my character rather than other people's comfort with my disability." "Is that why you're so good with David? Because you understand his experience?" "I understand the questions he's asking himself," Martha said. "Questions like, am I too much trouble? And, would people love me more if I were different? And, do I have to be perfect to deserve care?" I can help him find different answers than the ones I found. Jonathan studied her face, noting the strength that had been forged in childhood trauma, the wisdom earned through surviving what should have destroyed her spirit. "What answers do you help him find?" "That he's valuable exactly as he is, that love doesn't have to be earned through perfection, that his disability is one part of who he is, not a flaw that needs fixing." Martha's voice grew stronger with conviction. "That he deserves protection and care, not because he's inspiring or brave, but because he's human." The contrast between Martha's values and his own business practices hit Jonathan like a revelation. She measured worth by inherent human dignity. He measured it by productivity, profit potential, market value. "Martha," he said carefully, "what would you say about someone who knew that spending more money on safety measures could save lives, but chose profit margins instead?" Her eyes grew serious as she seemed to understand they were no longer talking hypothetically. "I'd say that person had forgotten something important about what makes life valuable. Even if those safety measures could bankrupt the company, cost thousands of jobs. There are always choices," Martha said quietly. "Maybe fewer luxury amenities and more safety protocols. Maybe smaller profit margins and better worker protections. The question is whether we're willing to sacrifice some comfort to ensure everyone's dignity." Jonathan felt the weight of her words settle into his consciousness. She wasn't judging him, but she was offering a different framework for thinking about the choices his wealth and power forced him to make daily. What if someone wanted to change how they made those decisions, but didn't know where to start? Martha smiled then, and Jonathan felt something warm unfurl in his chest. "I'd say they could start by asking different questions. Instead of, what's the cheapest solution? They could ask, what's the most ethical solution? Instead of, how do we minimize cost? They could ask, how do we honor everyone's value? Even if it means smaller profits. Even then. Because at the end of the day, how we treat the most vulnerable people says more about who we are than how much money we accumulate." Jonathan looked at this remarkable woman, someone who had survived abandonment and discrimination, who had turned her pain into wisdom and her experience into compassion, and realized he was seeing a completely different way of existing in the world. "Martha," he said, his voice oddly thick, "I think you're teaching me something important about what really matters." "David's teaching you," she corrected gently. "I'm just helping translate his questions into ones that adults can understand." That afternoon, Jonathan made a phone call to Jakarta that would cost his company millions, but ensure proper safety protocols for all future construction. He established a victims fund that went beyond legal requirements. He initiated a company-wide review of worker protections that prioritized human dignity over profit margins. And that evening, as he watched Martha help David with his homework, laughing together over some shared joke that excluded no one, Jonathan understood that he was falling in love, not with someone who would enhance his image or expand his network or fit seamlessly into his established life, but with someone who was teaching him to be a better man, one conversation at a time, someone who saw value where he had been blind to it, someone who loved his son not despite his disability, but as a complete, worthwhile human being who deserved protection and joy, someone who was showing him that the most important wealth couldn't be counted in dollars. Chapter 7. When Cruelty Knows No Bounds. David Nava had inherited his mother's intuition along with her eyes, which meant he knew exactly why Rita's hands shook when she looked at his leg braces and why Martha had started sleeping with her bedroom door open, listening for sounds that shouldn't exist in houses where children were supposed to be safe. The morning Jonathan left for his Philadelphia business conference, David watched his stepmother's face cycle through emotions too complex for most 8-year-olds to decode. But David wasn't most 8-year-olds. Living with a disability had taught him to read adult faces for signs of acceptance or rejection, patience or frustration, love or the absence of it. Rita's face showed something he'd never seen before, grief so raw it looked like physical pain. "I'll be back by dinner tomorrow," Jonathan had said, kissing David goodbye and squeezing Rita's shoulder with casual affection. "Try not to have too much fun without me." "We'll miss you," Rita replied with her practiced smile, but David caught the way her breath hitched, as if speaking required enormous effort. After Jonathan's car disappeared down the drive, Rita stood in the foyer for several minutes, staring at nothing. David approached her carefully, the way he'd learned to approach new situations that might overwhelm adults who weren't used to accommodating his needs. "Rita, are you feeling sad?" She startled as if she'd forgotten he existed. When she looked down at him, David saw something in her eyes that made his stomach clench with recognition. The look adults got when they were calculating whether caring for him was worth the effort required. "I'm fine, David," she said, but her voice carried an edge that hadn't been there when Papa was home. "Would you like to see the new picture I'm drawing?" David offered hopefully. "It's a family of dinosaurs, and they all have different abilities, but they work together to build their nest." Rita's face went completely white. "Not right now, David. I have things to do." She fled upstairs, leaving David standing alone in the foyer with the crushing weight of understanding that somehow his very existence was causing this woman pain. Martha found him there 20 minutes later, sitting on the bottom step with his crayons and drawing pad, trying to create something beautiful enough to fix whatever was broken in Rita's spirit. "Hey there, artist," Martha said gently, settling beside him on the stairs. "What are you working on?" "A picture to help Rita feel better," David explained, showing her his careful drawing of dinosaur families, where each member had different physical characteristics, but contributed to their community in unique ways. "She gets really sad when she looks at me, and I thought maybe if I drew something that showed how families can be happy, even when someone is different." Martha's expression grew troubled. "David, sweetheart, Rita's sadness isn't your responsibility to fix. Adults have complicated feelings sometimes that have nothing to do with the children around them. But she looks at my braces the same way Mrs. Henderson looked at her son's wheelchair before she sent him to live somewhere else," David said with devastating perceptiveness. Martha's breath caught. "What do you know about Mrs. Henderson's son?" "He was in my class last year, Tommy. He had muscular dystrophy and used a wheelchair, and his mom used to smile at him the same way Rita smiles at me, like she was trying really hard to feel happy but actually felt scared and sad." David's voice dropped to a whisper. "And then one day Tommy didn't come to school anymore, and Mrs. Peterson told us he went to live in a special place where people could take better care of him." The accuracy of David's reading of adult emotions was both remarkable and heartbreaking. Martha felt protective rage build in her chest as she realized that this brilliant child was already learning to anticipate abandonment based on subtle changes in adult behavior. "David, listen to me very carefully," Martha said, taking his small hands in hers. "Your papa will never send you away. Never. No matter what anyone else thinks or feels, you are exactly where you belong. But what if Rita tells Papa that taking care of me is too hard? What if she makes him choose between keeping me or keeping her? The question revealed the deep fear that haunted every disabled child who had learned too early that love could be conditional, that their needs might become too much for adults to handle. "That will never happen," Martha said fiercely, "and I will make sure of it." They were interrupted by the sound of Rita's heels clicking rapidly down the stairs. She appeared in the foyer carrying a large box that David recognized as containing his adaptive toys and equipment. "Rita?" David asked carefully. "What are you doing with my things?" "Cleaning and organizing," Rita replied, but her voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. "Some of this equipment is taking up too much space. We need to streamline." Martha stood slowly, her protective instincts fully activated. "Those are David's therapeutic tools. He uses them daily." "I'm perfectly capable of determining what David needs," Rita snapped, the mask of maternal warmth finally slipping completely. David watched this exchange with growing understanding. Rita wasn't organizing his equipment. She was removing it, making his environment less accommodating, creating barriers to his independence and comfort. "The parallel bars help me practice walking," David said quietly, "and the adaptive art supplies let me draw pictures. I need those things." "You need to learn that the world won't always accommodate your limitations," Rita replied, her voice growing sharper. "Coddling you with specialized equipment won't prepare you for real life." Martha stepped between Rita and the box of equipment. "David's accommodations aren't coddling. They're tools that allow him to participate fully in his own life." "Don't lecture me about special needs children," Rita snarled, and for a moment raw grief overwhelmed her careful composure. "I know more about the reality of caring for disabled children than you could possibly imagine." David studied Rita's face with the intensity he usually reserved for his scientific observations. "Rita, did you have a little boy like me before? Someone who needed special equipment and got hurt?" The question hit Rita like a physical blow. She went completely still, the box trembling in her hands. "His name was Miguel," she whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep and damaged. "He was 7. He had cerebral palsy, just like you. And I failed him." The admission hung in the air like a detonation. Martha felt understanding and horror wash over her in equal measure as Rita's behavior suddenly made devastating sense. "What happened to Miguel?" David asked with the gentle directness that made adults forget he was only 8 years old. "He fell," Rita said, her voice hollow with guilt. "I was tired, so tired from all the therapy appointments and medical equipment and constant vigilance. I looked away for 1 minute, just 1 minute to rest my eyes, and he tried to transfer from his wheelchair to his bed by himself, and he fell and he hit his head and—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. David understood with startling clarity why Rita's hands shook when she looked at his adaptive equipment, why his questions about family triggered such devastating grief. "I'm sorry Miguel got hurt," David said softly, "but I'm not Miguel, and Martha helps me be safe." "You could be Miguel," Rita said, her voice rising with barely controlled hysteria. "You have the same condition, the same needs, the same way of looking at people like you trust them to keep you safe. And I couldn't keep him safe. I can't keep anyone safe." Martha realized with growing alarm that Rita was having a complete psychological breakdown, projecting her unresolved trauma onto David in ways that were becoming increasingly dangerous. "Rita," Martha said carefully, "you need help processing Miguel's death. But David isn't responsible for your grief, and he doesn't deserve to be punished for surviving when Miguel didn't." "Punished?" Rita laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "I'm not punishing him, I'm preparing him. The world is going to hurt him, Martha. People are going to see his disability and decide he's too much trouble. Parents are going to give up on him when caring becomes too exhausting. I'm just teaching him the truth early. The truth, David said with startling wisdom, is that some people give up, but other people don't. Papa doesn't give up. Martha doesn't give up. Miguel's accident wasn't your fault, but taking away my things won't bring him back. Rita's face contorted with rage and grief. Don't you dare talk about Miguel. You don't know anything about what I've lost. She raised her hand as if to strike him, but David didn't cower. Instead, he stood his ground with remarkable composure and said something that would later prove to be the key to his own salvation. Martha, can you help me call Papa? I think Rita needs a doctor to help her feel better about Miguel, and I think we need Papa to come home now. The mature request, delivered with calm authority despite the threat of violence, seemed to shock Rita back to partial awareness of what she was doing. Martha moved swiftly to place herself between Rita and David, while mentally calculating how quickly she could get him to safety if Rita's breakdown escalated further. You're right, David, Martha said firmly. Let's call your papa right now. As David reached for the phone with steady hands, Martha realized that this brave, intelligent boy was not just surviving Rita's psychological assault, he was actively participating in his own rescue. But she also understood that they were running out of time before Rita's guilt and grief drove her to do something irreversibly damaging to the child who reminded her daily of her greatest failure. Chapter 8. The Breaking Point. Jonathan had never believed his 8-year-old son could save himself, until he burst through his front door to find David calmly documenting Rita's breakdown on his adaptive tablet, while Martha formed a human shield between trauma and innocence, and realized that sometimes the smallest warriors fight the biggest battles. Jonathan's phone had been buzzing insistently during his Philadelphia meeting, but protocol demanded silence during contract negotiations worth $40 million. When he finally checked his messages during a break, David's careful voice nearly brought him to his knees. Papa, this is David. I used Martha's phone to call you because Rita is very upset about her little boy Miguel who died, and she's saying things that make me think she might hurt me because I remind her of him. Martha is keeping me safe, but I think you should come home now. I love you. Please don't be scared. I'm being very smart about this. The mature composure in his son's voice, the way David had analyzed the situation and taken protective action, filled Jonathan with equal parts terror and fierce pride. He abandoned the meeting immediately, racing toward New York with his heart hammering against his ribs. Now, as he pulled into his driveway 90 minutes ahead of schedule, the house looked deceptively peaceful in the afternoon sunlight. But Jonathan had learned to read the subtle signs of distress in his son's environment, and something felt wrong. The front door was locked, unusual during daytime hours when staff were present. David's adaptive bicycle was lying on its side in the driveway rather than properly stored. Most telling of all, he could hear voices from inside the house, Rita's rising with hysteria, Martha's firm with protective determination, and David's clear with startling authority. Won't let you take away my communication device, David was saying as Jonathan quietly entered through the side door. I need it to call for help when adults aren't making good choices. You don't need to call anyone, Rita's voice cracked with desperation. I'm your mother. I know what's best for you. You're not my mother, David replied with devastating clarity. My real mother loved me enough to die so I could live. You're Miguel's mother, and you're sad he died, but I'm not Miguel. Jonathan moved silently through his house, following the sound of his son's voice toward what appeared to be a standoff in the living room. Through the doorway, he could see David seated in his wheelchair near the window. Positioned, Jonathan realized, so he could be seen from outside if anyone came looking for him. Martha stood between David and Rita, her posture protective but not aggressive. In her hands was David's adaptive tablet, which she appeared to be using to record the confrontation. Rita paced in front of them like a caged animal, her perfect composure completely shattered. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup streaked with tears, her hands shaking with barely controlled emotion. "He looks just like Miguel," Rita was saying, her voice broken with grief. "The same dark eyes, the same trust that people will protect him, the same way of asking questions that make you remember what love feels like. And I failed Miguel. I failed to keep him safe." "Rita," Martha said firmly but not unkindly, "David isn't Miguel, and your grief doesn't give you the right to frighten him." "I'm not frightening him," Rita screamed. "I'm preparing him. Do you know what it's like to watch a disabled child trust the world to be kind? Do you know what it's like when that trust gets them killed?" David looked up from his tablet, where Jonathan could see he was methodically documenting Rita's statements. "Rita, can you tell me exactly how Miguel died? Because I think maybe you're remembering it wrong because you're so sad." The question was delivered with the careful precision of someone trained to gather information, and Jonathan felt a surge of amazed pride at his son's courage and intelligence. Rita froze as if David had struck her. "What did you say?" "You said Miguel fell from his wheelchair and hit his head. But that doesn't usually happen unless safety straps aren't working right, or unless someone is trying to do something they shouldn't do alone." David's voice remained calm and analytical. "Did Miguel try to do something dangerous because he was upset about something?" "He was trying to reach his toy dinosaur," Rita whispered, the truth torn from her by David's relentless logic. "He'd been crying because I'd gotten angry about cleaning up his medical supplies. I told him he needed to learn to do more things independently. So he tried to transfer to his bed by himself to get his comfort toy, and the wheelchair moved, and he fell. So Miguel got hurt because he was trying to fix your feelings," David said with devastating accuracy. "And now you want to hurt me because you think that will fix your feelings about Miguel." The psychological insight from an 8-year-old left Rita completely exposed. Jonathan watched his son, this remarkable child who had survived his own physical challenges and was now surviving emotional assault, use his intelligence as both weapon and shield. "I don't want to hurt you," Rita sobbed. "I want to protect you from what I couldn't protect him from." "But you're the thing I need protection from right now," David pointed out with irrefutable logic. "You took away my adaptive equipment. You told me I was too much trouble. You made me feel like I was broken. Miguel needed protection from an accident, but I need protection from you." It was then that Rita raised her hand, not in anger, but in desperate grief, reaching toward David as if to touch the face of the child she'd lost. Martha moved instantly, placing herself between Rita's outstretched hand and David's vulnerable position. "Don't touch him." "Please," Rita begged, "just let me. He looks so much like Miguel, just for a moment." "No," Martha said firmly. "David is not your dead son. He's not responsible for your grief, and he's not going to be traumatized by your need to make him into someone else." That's when Rita's control finally snapped completely. "You don't understand. You can't understand. You weren't there when the doctors said there was nothing they could do. You didn't hold your disabled child while he died because you failed to keep him safe." She lunged forward, not to strike but to grab, trying to pull David into an embrace that would have been more about her need than his safety. Martha caught Rita's arms, preventing contact, while David calmly continued recording and said the words that would later ensure Rita could never hurt another child. "Rita is trying to touch me even though I said no, and Martha is protecting me. Rita told me that Miguel died because she got angry, and he tried to fix her feelings. I think Rita needs help with her grief, but she shouldn't be around kids like me until she gets that help." Jonathan exploded into the room at that moment, his voice shaking the windows. "What the hell is happening here?" All three figures froze, Rita with her hands still caught in Martha's grip, Martha in protective position, and David looking up from his tablet with remarkable composure. "Papa," David said with relief but not panic. I called you because Rita is having big feelings about Miguel, and I thought you should know that she's been trying to make me into him instead of letting me be me." Jonathan stared at his son, this 8-year-old boy who had analyzed a dangerous psychological situation, taken steps to protect himself, gathered evidence, and summoned help, and felt a profound shift in his understanding of David's capabilities. "Show me," Jonathan said simply. David played back several recorded segments. Rita admitting that she saw Miguel when she looked at him, her confession about the circumstances of Miguel's death, her attempt to remove his adaptive equipment, her stated belief that disabled children needed to be prepared for a cruel world through preemptive rejection. "David," Jonathan said carefully, "how long has this been going on?" "Since you left for Philadelphia. But I think Rita's been sad about Miguel since she moved in with us. I've been trying to help her feel better, but Martha explained that kids can't fix grown-up problems." Jonathan looked at Martha, who had finally released Rita's arms but remained in protective position. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine. David handled most of this himself. He's been incredibly brave and smart." Jonathan knelt beside his son's wheelchair, studying the boy's face for signs of trauma. What he saw instead was strength, intelligence, and a composure that suggested David had never doubted that help would come. "Were you scared?" Jonathan asked gently. "A little," David admitted. "But mostly I was sad for Rita. She misses Miguel so much that she forgot I'm a different person who deserves to be safe." The mature understanding in his son's voice brought tears to Jonathan's eyes. David had faced psychological assault and responded not with fear or anger, but with compassion tempered by appropriate self-protection. "Papa," David continued, "I think Rita needs doctors to help her with her sad feelings about Miguel. But she shouldn't live with families that have kids like me anymore, because her sadness makes her want to hurt us." Jonathan looked at Rita, who had collapsed into a chair, her breakdown complete. She was no longer the manipulative woman who had deceived him into marriage, but she was also no longer safe to be around his vulnerable child. "Rita," he said quietly, "you're going to pack your things and leave, today, and you're going to get help for your grief, but you will never be alone with David again." "Jonathan, please," Rita whispered. "I didn't mean to. I just miss him so much." "I understand that you're grieving," Jonathan replied firmly, "but grief doesn't excuse putting my son in danger. David deserves protection, not punishment for surviving when Miguel didn't." As Rita was escorted from the house by security Jonathan had summoned, David rolled his wheelchair closer to his father and Martha. "Papa," he said thoughtfully, "I think I handled that pretty well for a kid with a disability, don't you?" Jonathan gathered his son into his arms, marveling at this remarkable child who had faced danger with intelligence and grace, who had protected himself while showing compassion for his attacker. "You handled it like a hero," Jonathan said firmly, "like someone who knows exactly how valuable he is." And as Martha smiled through her tears, Jonathan realized that his son had just taught them all something profound about strength, wisdom, and the different ways that love could manifest itself in protection. Chapter 9. Shattered Illusions. 6 months after David's recorded testimony helped convict Rita of child endangerment, Dr. Sarah Mitchell looked across her office at a remarkable 8-year-old who had not only survived psychological assault, but emerged with wisdom that humbled the adults around him, and asked the question that would change everything. "Do you think you're ready to have a new mother who chooses you because she loves you, not because she's trying to fix her own sadness?" The child psychologist's office had become as familiar as their own home during the lengthy healing process. Soft lighting, adaptive toys, and Dr. Mitchell's patient presence had helped David process Rita's breakdown and his own courageous response with remarkable maturity. "I think," David said carefully, considering the question with the seriousness he brought to all important matters, That I've learned the difference between people who love kids because of what we can do for them and people who love us because of who we are. Jonathan felt his chest tighten with pride and residual grief. The legal proceedings against Rita had been emotionally exhausting, but ultimately validating. District Attorney Patricia Hoffman had built a compelling case using David's recorded evidence, Martha's corroborating testimony, and expert psychological evaluation of Rita's unprocessed trauma. Mrs. Castellanos showed clear intent to emotionally abuse a vulnerable child, DA Hoffman had stated during sentencing. While her grief over her deceased son, Miguel, is tragic and understandable, it does not excuse placing another disabled child in psychological danger. Her actions were calculated to undermine David Nava's sense of safety and self-worth. Rita had received 5 years supervised probation, mandatory grief counseling, and a permanent restraining order. Her tearful apology in court had felt genuine but insufficient, too little, too late for a child who had already learned to protect himself from her projected trauma. How do you feel about the idea of eventually having another mother figure? Dr. Mitchell continued gently. Someone who would choose to love you without trying to turn you into someone else. David's face lit up with immediate understanding. You mean Martha? But she already is my mom in every way that matters. She protects me and helps me learn things and loves me even when I have bad days with my braces. Jonathan exchanged a look with Martha, who sat quietly in the corner chair where she'd been attending David's sessions for months. Her presence had become so natural, so essential, that sometimes Jonathan forgot she had originally been hired help rather than family. David has expressed consistently that he feels secure in his relationship with Martha, Dr. Mitchell noted, consulting her extensive notes. He's also mentioned several times that he believes you and Martha care about each other in a way that goes beyond professional caregiving. Heat rose in Jonathan's cheeks. Had his growing feelings for Martha become so obvious that even his son's therapist could observe them? Is that something that would make you happy, David? Dr. Mitchell asked. If your father and Martha decided to become a family officially? It would make me the happiest kid in the whole world, David replied without hesitation. Martha understands what it's like to be different, and she never makes me feel like I need to be fixed. And Papa smiles more when she's around, and he asks her opinion about important things, which means he respects her brain as much as her kindness. The 8-year-old's emotional intelligence never ceased to amaze Jonathan. David had observed and analyzed the adult relationships around him with startling accuracy. And you feel ready for that kind of change, Dr. Mitchell pressed gently. After everything that happened with Rita? David was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Rita taught me something important, he said finally. She taught me that some people's love is really about them, not about the person they're supposed to love. But Martha's love is about me, about helping me be the best version of myself, not trying to make me into someone else. That's a very wise distinction, Doctor, Mitchell observed. What makes you sure about the difference? Because when Rita looked at me, she saw Miguel, but when Martha looks at me, she sees David. She remembers things I like, and she helps me solve problems in ways that work for my brain, and she never acts like my disability is something that makes her sad. That evening, after David was asleep, Jonathan found Martha in the kitchen preparing his school lunch for the next day, a routine she'd maintained even after her job description had evolved far beyond household management. Martha, he said, settling at the counter across from her, we need to talk. She looked up with those warm brown eyes that had become such a source of comfort over the past months. About David's session today? About us, Jonathan said simply. About what we've become to each other. Martha's hand stilled on the sandwich she was preparing. Jonathan, I love you, he said, cutting through any pretense or professional boundaries they might still be maintaining. Not because you're wonderful with David, though you are, not because you saved him from Rita, though you did. I love you because you've taught me what real strength looks like. You've shown me that the most important protection I can offer my son isn't money or privilege. It's surrounding him with people who see his worth. Tears filled Martha's eyes. I love you too. I've loved you both for so long, but I never imagined you could see me as more than David's caregiver. How could I not? Jonathan moved around the counter, close enough to see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. You're everything I didn't know I needed. You're everything David needs. You're home, Martha. When he kissed her, it was with the certainty of someone who had found not just romantic love, but partnership in its deepest form, two people united in protecting and nurturing what mattered most. Marry me, he whispered against her lips. Yes, she breathed without hesitation, but I want to adopt David too, legally, so he never has to worry about someone taking his family away again. Already arranged, Jonathan smiled. I contacted Family Services weeks ago. They're just waiting for us to file the paperwork. The next morning, they told David over breakfast, though his reaction suggested he'd been expecting this development for months. Finally, he exclaimed, raising his adaptive fork in triumph. Can we have a wedding with dinosaur decorations? And can I walk Martha down the aisle since I'm the one who knew she should be my mom? Martha laughed through happy tears. All of that sounds perfect, sweetheart. The adoption proceedings moved quickly given the circumstances. Judge Patricia Reynolds, who specialized in family court, smiled warmly as she reviewed the extensive documentation of Martha's care for David. Mr. Nava, she said during the final hearing, the court notes that Miss Wallace has been David's primary caregiver and emotional support throughout the trauma of Mrs. Castellanos's psychological abuse. Her intervention likely prevented significant harm to your son. She saved his life, Jonathan replied simply, in every way that matters. And David, Judge Reynolds addressed him directly, do you understand what adoption means? It means Martha becomes my real mom forever and ever, with legal papers and everything, so nobody can ever take her away from me, David replied with complete confidence. That's exactly right, and Ms. Wallace, do you understand the lifelong commitment you're making? I understand that I'm gaining the greatest privilege of my life, Martha said, her voice thick with emotion. David is an extraordinary child, and I promise to love and protect him for the rest of my life. When Judge Reynolds declared the adoption final, David launched himself into Martha's arms with such enthusiasm that court observers reached for tissues. Mama, he said, testing out the word he'd been saving for this moment. My real mama. My son, Martha whispered back. My beautiful, brilliant, perfect son. Jonathan watched this exchange with overwhelming gratitude. Rita's psychological assault had nearly destroyed his son's sense of safety and worth. But Martha's fierce protection and David's own remarkable resilience had not only healed the damage, they had created something stronger and more beautiful than what existed before. Papa, David said later that evening as they planned the wedding, I know you loved my angel mama very much. Do you think she would be happy about you marrying Martha? Jonathan considered the question seriously. I think she would love Martha because Martha loves you the way she would have. Because Martha makes you feel safe and valued and cherished. Good, David said with satisfaction. Because I want all my parents to like each other, my angel mama in heaven, my papa here with me, and my new mama who chose me. As Jonathan tucked David into bed that night, his son wrapped his arms around his father's neck and whispered, Thank you for keeping me safe from Rita and for finding me the best mama in the whole world. She found us, buddy, Jonathan replied softly. Martha found us and saved us both. Standing in the doorway of David's room, watching his son sleep peacefully, Jonathan marveled at the strange journey that had brought them to this point. Rita's deception and psychological abuse could have destroyed their family. Instead, it had revealed the depth of Martha's love and David's strength, forging bonds that no one could ever break. They were going to be more than okay. They were going to be happy. Love had won, not the desperate, possessive love that Rita had confused with grief, but the generous, protective love that Martha embodied every day. Chapter 10. Love Reborn from Ashes. 9 months after Martha Wallace legally became David Nava's mother, she stood in Eleanor's rose garden wearing her grandmother's pearls and her son's hand-drawn boutonniere, waiting to marry the man who had learned that the deepest love isn't born from perfection, but from the courage to protect what matters most, and realized that some families aren't found. They're forged in the fire of choosing each other again and again. "Mama, you look like a princess who could also fight dragons," David announced proudly, adjusting his own boutonniere, a tiny white rose surrounded by hand-drawn dinosaurs that somehow managed to look both whimsical and elegant. Martha knelt carefully in her ivory dress, taking her son's hands in hers. The past months had transformed David from a frightened child walking on eggshells around a disturbed stepmother to a confident boy who understood his own worth and had learned to advocate for his needs with remarkable maturity. "Thank you, sweetheart. Are you ready to walk me down the aisle?" "I've been ready since the day I met you," David replied with 8-year-old sincerity. "I knew you were supposed to be my mama because you looked at me like I was exactly right, not like I was something that needed fixing." The wedding was taking place in Eleanor's garden, despite her doctor's reservations about her hosting such an event. At 76 and increasingly frail, Jonathan's mother had insisted on creating what she called a proper celebration of love earned through tribulation. "Nonsense," she had declared when Jonathan suggested moving the ceremony to a hotel. "This family has survived deception, trauma, and psychological warfare. If that doesn't deserve to be celebrated in a place filled with beauty and history, I don't know what does." The guest list was deliberately intimate, people who had witnessed their journey and understood the significance of this moment. Dr. Sarah Mitchell sat in the front row, having become not just David's therapist, but a treasured family friend. Detective Patricia Morrison was there, having followed their recovery with personal investment. Judge Patricia Reynolds, who had finalized David's adoption, attended as both legal witness and friend. But the most important presence was David himself, not just witnessing his father's wedding, but serving as the one to give Martha away, symbolizing his role in choosing his own family. "Before we go out there," Martha said gently, "I want you to know something. Your angel mama would be so proud of the boy you've become. You survived something terrible, and instead of letting it make you fearful or bitter, you let it teach you about strength and wisdom." David's expression grew thoughtful. "Do you think she knows about Rita and what happened?" "I think she knows that when you needed protection, you were smart enough to seek help. I think she knows that you used your intelligence to save yourself while still showing compassion for someone who was hurting." Martha's voice grew stronger with conviction. "I think she's proud that you chose love over fear." "And she knows you're the mama I always needed?" "I hope so. I hope she knows that loving you is the greatest privilege of my life." David threw his arms around her neck, careful not to wrinkle her dress. "I love you, Mama. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for choosing me right back, sweetheart." The ceremony itself was perfect in its authenticity. David walked Martha down the aisle with careful pride, his leg braces creating a rhythmic sound that had become the percussion of their family's daily life. Guests murmured about how handsome he looked, how confident, how clearly loved. Jonathan waited at the altar, wearing the expression of a man who had found something he hadn't known he was searching for. Not a replacement for what he'd lost with Rhonda, but something entirely new and equally precious. "Papa," David announced when they reached the front, "here's your new wife and my forever mama." The laughter that rippled through the garden was warm and inclusive, setting the tone for a celebration of joy earned through adversity. Jonathan's vows were heartfelt. "Martha, you came into our lives as a guardian angel and became our salvation. You showed me that love isn't about finding someone who fits into your existing life. It's about building something new together. You protected my son when he needed it most, and in doing so, you taught me what real courage looks like. I promise to spend the rest of my life being worthy of the trust you've placed in both of us." Martha's vows brought tears to every eye. "Jonathan, you gave me the greatest gift imaginable, the chance to love and protect an extraordinary child who needed someone in his corner. David, my brilliant boy, you chose me to be your mama, and I choose you to be my son, today and always. I promise to love you both fiercely and protectively through every challenge and celebration that comes our way. We are not just getting married today, we are celebrating the family we chose to become." When they exchanged rings, David proudly held the ring pillow and announced, "Now we're officially the strongest family ever." The kiss was sweet and full of promise, and when they broke apart, their son was right there between them, demanding his own family hug. Eleanor, despite her wheelchair and oxygen tank, raised her champagne glass for a toast. To a family that proved love isn't just about the easy moments, it's about standing together when the world tries to break you apart. As the reception continued around them, Jonathan found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. Rita's psychological assault could have destroyed David's confidence and trust. Instead, it had revealed the depth of his son's wisdom and Martha's protective love. "Any regrets?" he asked Martha as they swayed together during their first dance, David spinning nearby in his wheelchair with pure joy. "Only that David had to suffer before we found each other," Martha replied honestly. "But not about us, not about this family we've built." "Mama, Papa," David called from the edge of the dance floor. "Come see what I made for our family." They joined their son, who had set up an easel with his latest artwork, a family portrait that showed all of them holding hands under a rainbow, with a special edition that made Martha's breath catch. "I drew Angel Mama watching from the clouds," David explained proudly, "because I think she's happy that we're all together now. She gave Papa the best son ever, and now Mama Martha gets to take care of me the way Angel Mama would have wanted." Jonathan felt emotion tighten his throat as he studied his son's artwork. David had found a way to honor Rhonda's memory while celebrating their new family configuration, not replacing his birth mother, but expanding the circle of love to include everyone who had protected and cherished him. "It's perfect," Martha whispered, her voice thick with tears. "We're all exactly where we're supposed to be." As the evening deepened and guests began to depart with stories of the most meaningful wedding they'd ever attended, the new family found themselves alone in the garden, still in their wedding clothes, but with shoes kicked off and formal jackets abandoned. David was chasing fireflies with a net, his laughter echoing through the twilight while Eleanor watched from her wheelchair with deep satisfaction. "You know what the most beautiful thing about today was?" Martha asked as she and Jonathan watched their son play. "What's that?" David's complete confidence. He's not worried about being abandoned or rejected anymore. He knows he's chosen and protected and loved unconditionally. Jonathan pulled her closer, marveling at this woman who had taken on the protection of a vulnerable child without hesitation, who had turned her own experience with disability into wisdom and strength. "Mama, Papa," David called, his voice bright with excitement. "I caught a firefly. Can we all make a wish together?" They formed a circle around the mason jar, holding one tiny blinking light, father, mother, and son, bound together by choice and commitment, and the kind of love that could overcome any darkness. "What should we wish for?" Martha asked. David considered this with characteristic seriousness. "I think we should wish that all kids who are different or scared get families who love them exactly the way they are, and that mean people like Rita get help with their sadness so they stop hurting kids." As David opened the jar and the fireflies spiraled up into the darkening sky, Jonathan thought about the courage it had taken to build this family. Martha's decision to protect David despite the risk to her job and future. David's wisdom in recognizing danger and seeking help. His own choice to prioritize his son's safety over social expectations. Rita had tried to destroy them with her unhealed trauma and projected grief. Instead, she had revealed the unbreakable bonds between people who choose to love and protect each other. "I love you both," Jonathan said as they watched the firefly disappear into the stars. "More than I ever thought possible." "We love you too, Papa," David said, slipping his small hands into both his parents', "all the way to the dinosaurs and back." And as they stood together in the garden, surrounded by the remnants of their perfect wedding day and the promise of countless tomorrows, Jonathan knew that they had found something rare and precious. They had built a family not on biology or obligation, but on choice. They had chosen to love each other, to protect each other, to face whatever came next together. Martha had risked everything to save David, and in doing so she had saved them all. Rita's cruelty had tried to teach David that disabled children were burdens to be endured. Instead, he had learned that he was a treasure to be protected. In the end, love had won, not the possessive, conditional love that demands perfection, but the generous, protective love that sees worth in every human being. And in the soft glow of garden lights and the gentle chorus of night sounds, the Nava family began the next chapter of their story. Together, complete and unbreakable. The end.